Hi, everyone. I'm glad you made it in time for that. That was a cool way to start the seminar. I'm Zach Lesser, professor in the English department, and I co-organized the seminar with Jerry Singerman of the Penn Press.
Hello, everyone.
And John Pollack, Kislak Center.
Hi, everybody.
And Philip Mogan, who's our graduate fellow.
Hi, everyone.
Well, welcome back, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Erin McGuirl to the seminar. I've been looking forward to this week since we arranged it way back when. We haven't done a ton of film-related sessions in the past, and it's really wonderful to have such a virtuosic bibliographer introduce us to the material textuality of screenplays. Erin has a BA in the history of art from Middlebury College and an MLIS in rare book librarianship from the Palmer School. She's worked in special collections libraries, including the New York Society Library, and as an independent consultant to both institutional and private libraries. And now, as she says on her website, she works exclusively with Robert M. Rubin's collection of screenplays and other cinematic X-formation. And since we're talking about movies, I admit that the first thing I thought of when I read this on her website was the line from The Godfather when Tom Hagen says, "I have a special practice, I handle one client." But this is bibliography and not monster law. So, and I'm very pleased that Robert Rubin is able to attend the seminar tonight. Welcome. Erin has received fellowships for her research from the Bibliographical Society in the UK, the Ransom Center, and the Rare Book School. And she's also taught at the Rare Book School and at the Pratt Institute. And since 2018, she's served as executive director of the Bibliographical Society of America. And there, I think it's fair to say that she's done a lot of work to open up the society to a more diverse range of interests and scholars, and to engage younger scholars in bibliography, both through webinars and online events over the past years at Bibliography Week, and in the creation and implementation of their equity action plan. Erin has published on screenplays in Printing History, in the Ransom Center magazine, and elsewhere. And she's also published a series of articles on the printing, publishing, and distribution of the Whole Earth catalog and its numerous countercultural offspring. And I think both of these strands come together in Erin's emphasis on the importance of thinking through 20th century office culture and practices in the consideration of the material texts that emerge from those environments. And I think that will, it sounds like it will probably play a role in tonight's presentation on script supervision. So please join me in welcoming Erin to the seminar.
Hi. Thank you. I'm just so honored and thrilled to be here. So I want to thank the seminar for the invitation. I also want to thank the collector I work with, Bob Rubin, and because it's my work with his collection and his generosity and openness to scholarly collaboration in that work that are putting me here today. So the scripts I'll be talking about tonight are both from Mr. Rubin's collection, and I'm really excited that I can actually page through stuff. I also want to point out that I've learned a tremendous amount from booksellers in my work on screenplays, and Kevin Johnson has been especially generous from Royal Books. So he's also here tonight. Thanks for coming, Kevin. And I just want to make sure I recognize his leadership in the field before I got here. So this evening I will offer readings of two artifacts of textual production in two media, print and film. Bibliographers and book historians have traditionally focused on the former, with the latter with books occasionally coming into play when people think about the use of books as props in movies. But when reading movies as a type of text, as material texts in and of themselves, what about that? What does that look like? More specifically, movies start out as printed texts. So how does that transformation from print to motion picture take place? Bringing up my slide now. Okay. So materially speaking, movies can be described as synchronized multimedia presentations of recorded images and sound. I focus specifically on recorded images. I haven't yet jumped into the world of cinematic sound recording and editing, but maybe someday that will come. Motion pictures cameras use film stock, so this picture at the top, spools of transparent plastic coated on one side with a gelatin emulsion. The emulsion is light sensitive thanks to the presence of microscopic silver halide crystals, just like still film. And with exposure to light, the particles record figures in motion in three-dimensional space. After exposure, film stock is developed to produce a negative from which other copies can be made. So that's on the bottom left here. Negatives are so called because forms appear in the negative color values of the image as it was captured. So black is white, white is black. Negatives are the printing surface from which positive copies are made. That's on the right. Positive prints, as they're called, pass through a light projector, and that's what they're doing when we're sitting in a dark theater, eyes fixed on the screen, absorbed in movie magic. Editors play a critical role in the filmmaking process. They could take a huge body of raw material generated by a camera on set and work with the director to select, sequence, and stitch together the footage that tells the story best. A movie is different from a stage play in many ways, but for our purposes, it's useful to think about the fact that stage plays are written for an audience that views the action from a single, immovable position. Movies, on the other hand, show action in the round and at varying degrees of closeness to the actor on the set. Performances are repeated numerous times to generate film showing, for example, one actor speaking to another. The camera first generates footage of actor A as they listen and speak at a distance and then in close-up. Then the camera is moved to record actor B as they listen and speak at a distance and then in close-up. What we experience as a single continuous conversation between two people actually represents multiple performances. This might help to explain what you're looking at in the editing suite. Look at all those reels of films. There's stacks over here, stacks down here. How do they navigate all of that technologically mediated raw footage? You see down here, the editor is using something called a moviola that projects into a little screen down here the film he's watching so he can actually see the figures in motion. Without some kind of aid, this would be just unimaginable. Imagine needing to find something within a collection of thousands of scrolls, some of which were dozens or even hundreds of feet long, and not having an inventory or a catalog. Enter the script supervisor. Script supervisors are members of the crew that, among other things, organize and catalog the raw materials so that the editors know what was shot and can find the media they need efficiently. As artifacts of productions, their annotated scripts describe the raw footage from which the final cut was made. Even if the raw footage or negatives are now lost, these documents can give us a pretty good idea of how the script, which might differ dramatically from the film, was performed and recorded. As Mary Cebulski says in her script supervising manual, Beyond Continuity, movies are never shot in story order. Instead, we record little bits of picture and sound whenever it makes the most financial sense. It is the script supervisor's job to make sure that all these little bits work together after the editors assemble them. Good continuity on set is essential for good narrative flow in the final cut. So continuity is about the physical pictures captured by light on the film. I've been thinking of the script supervisor as a living catchword, or perhaps more literally, the person who makes sure that the catchwords actually function to ensure continuity of text. You may have noticed that in all the images I've shown of script supervisors at work, they're standing right next to the director. Here's Meta Carpenter. We'll look at one of her annotated scripts in a minute, next to director Norman Jewson here on the set of In the Heat of the Night. This is extremely common, and still today, script supervisors are close collaborators with the director and other creative film workers. This is unusual in filmmaking. Most of the folks working on a picture collaborate closely with the people in their department, and that's it. The job requires a deep knowledge of every aspect of the filmmaking process and some creativity. A working script supervisor I met with told me that she always proposes a solution to the errors that she finds, whether it's in her pre-reading of the script before production or actually during production on set. It's up to the director or the cameraman or costumer or whoever to take that suggestion or not, but when they do, her ideas actually do end up in the movie. Despite this, script supervisors and their textual output have not been well studied by film historians. I think it's in part because of the way that paper-based cinematic material has been collected. Collections are usually built around people with highly visible creative roles in filmmaking, like directors, screenwriters, and actors, or around major corporate or production entities, entire studios, producers. Within those discrete collections, you often find lots of scripts, which is great, but the script supervisor's script doesn't usually end up in the director's archive. Script supervisor, or a search for script supervisor, doesn't produce a single relevant result in Archive Grid and only 14 results in WorldCat. So scripts also don't tend to be treated as books, or manuscripts for that matter. And when they are, even the most basic elements of their physicality, like foliation or pagination, aren't recorded. I think it's worth noting that I discovered this material through my work with a collection of film noir, Western, and New Hollywood scripts. Mr. Rubin is particularly interested in scripts that tell the stories of individual films in those genres, and even collects in multiple variant copies. I'm not aware of any institutions acquiring cinematic materials in this way. So with that in mind, let's go back to the scripts themselves, and I'm going to change my screen share to this. Okay. So this is Meta Wild's annotated copy of the script for The King of Marvin Gardens. I'm going to flip forward to the title page, which is obviously not at the front of the script. That's not it either. Here it is. The movie was originally called The Philosopher King, and you can see here are a few pages of the script. This is Wild's working copy, the book she carried around with her day after day on the set. It contains her contemporaneous notes about the production, all scribbled down in pencil as things happened. She used it to guide her through her work on the set and to generate an edited and typed text that she passed on to the editor. We're going to look at one of those when we go back to the McCabe script. So if you've noticed that the title page appears pretty far into this book, you're right. Let's start at the beginning. Marvin Gardens, The King of Marvin Gardens, was made in 1971 and shot almost entirely on location in Atlantic City, New Jersey. The script is bound with 2 brads. Those are right here. And I'm going to remove them, partly because it makes the object a little bit easier to handle on a flat surface, but also to highlight something about their functionality. For people who don't know, if you haven't seen a brad, that's a brad. Okay. The brad binding makes it easy to create the book that Meta Wild needed on set. The script is continually revised throughout the production and pre-production processes, so scripts have cancels. And film workers like Meta Wild also incorporated other text she needed throughout the production into her scripts, creating sort of a Frankenstein. I've seen other scripts that take advantage of the brad binding in exactly the same way. I think it would be easy to think of brads as materially insignificant, perhaps markers of a corporate or a DIY publishing context, and some might even see them as disqualification for thinking of a script as a book. In fact, brads are a good design choice, especially when you can anticipate the need to update your text. There aren't many cases where even the most traditionally bookish book lives its entire life as a static, uninterfered with textual object. And the script, with its brad binding, embraces that notion fully, showing just how functional and flexible the book can be as a structure for organizing textual information in a sequence. So the first quarter of Wild's script is made up of production-related materials. A crew list is here. Then we have a cast list. As I'm going through, make sure you definitely note all this wonderful typographic variation. Then there are character descriptions, so she knows sort of the general idea of who each character is meant to be on set or in the movie. Some blanks for note-taking. She never used these, but they are here. And then we have a shooting schedule. So one of the great things I love about all that textual or typographic variation that I pointed out is that shows that all these documents are produced at different times on different machines, possibly in different places, and it's all stitched together with those brads, held together with those brads. So, okay. The shooting schedule is a key document in this group because it documents the plan for production that they more or less followed. I love how she folded the leaves of the shooting schedule on alternating diagonals, which created a simple tabbing mechanism. So when the script is closed, the folds make it possible to use touch alone to open to the page of your script. I didn't demonstrate that very well there, but the page of the script that you want to see. So if we open it, also you can see the whole shooting schedule. They say, okay, this is the 36th day of the shoot. This is the date. Here's what we're shooting. Here's who needs to be on set, et cetera, et cetera. So after the shooting schedule, we get to the script, which I already showed you that title page. And I want to turn now to a specific scene to show you how Meta Wild managed continuity on the set. So if any of you know the film, you will remember the moment when Sally, who's played by Ellen Burstyn, locks herself in the bathroom of a hotel. It's not the one that she's staying in, but the one that her con artist boyfriend Jason, played by Bruce Dern, has told her that he owns. And she's fed up with the rusty water in their hotel room. She feels entitled to a bath over there. Confrontation with management ensues. This page is littered with annotations related to continuity supervision. So down at the bottom, I'm going to zoom in here. Okay, this X marks in the middle of Jason's dialogue marks she put this X here and she wrote Surtees takes glasses off in the right margin. Hopefully you can all see that. This means that at this point in the dialogue, the hotel manager, Surtees, removes his glasses. He has to do that at the same point in the dialogue in every single take. Same thing in his dialogue above. Right here. At the X, he moves across the room. She's making sure that the editors don't end up with footage that shows Surtees with his glasses on after we've seen him take them off. She's also annotating the script with dialogue as it's spoken during the shoot. So I'm going to zoom up a little bit. There we go. Bruce Dern doesn't actually say, "Glad I caught you," as printed, but rather Sergeant Patch. This is Ralph Surtees again. He's imitating the hotel manager. And then, "No, no, no, quite all right," instead of "just as well." That's all right here. Minor things, but the actors will need to remember just what they've said from take to take to make sure that everything is consistent. And this really comes in handy when the same scene is shot over multiple days. Parts of this scene were actually shot a few weeks apart. At the top up here, you can see she writes 12/7 because this was shot on December 7th, and a few pages earlier, we see 119. This is all the same scene. There they are in front of the bathroom. We'll get to those in a minute. And so you can imagine, people forget things, especially when things are a week apart. Here she is making sure that everything is all going to match up from take to take to take. So in addition to her verbal notes, she also used photographic material. Just going to make a couple more adjustments here. She also used photographic material to keep track of continuity. I think that these are clipping from contact sheets taken by the film supervisor or the still photographer, David Friedman. I'm going to show you a picture of contact sheets so you know what those look like. Contact sheets are used by photographers to get a preliminary sense of what their photographs look like before they're printed in a larger format. They're made by laying the negatives directly on top of photosensitive paper, exposing the paper to light through the negatives, and then bathing the paper in a chemical solution that desensitizes it and renders visible the images. The images are the same size as the camera negatives. So going back, I think these little pictures are clipped from a contact sheet. And we'll get a little closer here. And part of the reason I think that is because they're the same size as negatives. And also because we have these little white marks at the bottom, I think are the same, are the sort of top trim. The numbers that we saw on those Cool Hand Luke contact sheets, those would have been here, and she's just trimmed a little bit messily. So these photographic annotations might have served her as aide-memoire that helped her deal with the non-continuous production of a scene. Then so the manuscript notes, ooh, there we go. You can tell I'm getting used to using this thing, but it's pretty cool, I think. The manuscript notes and photographic images that Wilde added to her script speak to the work she did to preserve continuity. As moviegoers, we don't see any evidence of this work unless something goes wrong, that coffee cup in Game of Thrones. This material text makes visible that work, which is, in itself is directly connected to the materiality of film. It has an effect on the images recorded with light on film stock. In looking at the script so far, I've mostly talked about the evidence we read, that is verbal, textual, written evidence, but there is also a lot to learn from more traditional methods of bibliographical analysis. So jumping ahead, scripts are produced on typewriters and then reproduced with office duplication machines. Mimeo, offset multilith, and photocopy machines were most commonly used to print scripts in large numbers from a single setting of type. Carbon copies were frequently used to create just a few copies. Clean copies of the script are normally technologically consistent. In other words, every leaf is typically printed in the same way. Variation does occur, however, and when it does, it's a clue. So the copy of the shooting script that Wilde originally received and to which she added all this stuff, sort of making her Frankenscript, was printed mimeographically, and that's what we're looking at here, a mimeographically printed sheet. So if you wanted to know which leaves of Wilde's Frankenscript formed the script that she was originally handed, you could figure that out by finding all of the Mimeo printed leaves. The next two leaves are carbon copy typescripts on Borum and Pease no-tear paper. I love that she's using this enforced paper because she knows she's moving this around. She wants to protect those punch holes. These pages represent a scene and dialogue spoken by Jack Nicholson's character, David Stabler, who works as a radio monologuist, and in this scene, he is speaking and recording one of his monologues. I haven't seen another copy of the script, so I don't know how the dialogue was written originally, but according to the AFI catalog, Nicholson improvised some or all of his monologues. The new dialogue would have prompted Wilde to retype these leaves and to update her script. If we found the copy of the script that Wilde handed over to the editor, we might see ribbon copies of these leaves. Then we have yet another printing method. And these are leaves printed on a fax machine. By 1971, the year of the film's production, fax technology was common in the US. And according to a 1971 ad for Xerox telecopiers, you could rent machines for about $2 a day. I would love to get my hands on a budget for this film to see if they actually did that. But the coated paper stock, and I think you can kind of see hopefully you can kind of see that shimmer, maybe, of the coating on the paper stock is the dead giveaway that this was printed on a fax. And it also is using another typeface. So this suggests, I don't know if it's for sure, but it suggests that it may have been rewritten by someone who was not on the set. Maybe the screenwriter, Jacob Brackman, was still in LA. He comes up with some new dialogue. He faxes it to them in Atlantic City. So footage shot for these pages was actually never incorporated into the final cut of the movie. Perhaps this copy of the script, which can clue us into late changes, might prompt us to ask questions that would explain why. So I also want to talk a little bit about sort of certain manuscript aspects of this. Wilde's choice of writing implement is always deliberate. You'll notice here that she's erasing quite a lot. I'm not sure if you can really see very well. I think you probably can't, but this is actually mostly an eraser, and that's because the dialogue's constantly changing. Things are just always in flux. So she's very deliberately using a pencil. Looking at the gutter here, and especially if the brads were in, this is definitely the sort of edge of the gutter. These look like little black pencil or pen marks, but they're actually fragments of her eraser, which she's brushing into the gutter after she makes her erasures. The script is totally filled with these. She's also using red and blue ink. You can only see red in this page, but there's lots of blue. Here's some blue throughout. I'm not entirely certain how she's using these or what these mean yet, but if I was doing a series study of this film, I would definitely want to figure that out. So I know there's probably been like a glaring thing I haven't talked about yet, which are these lines and these numbers. So I'm going to switch back over to the McCabe script to talk about those. Okay. So if you joined us a few minutes early tonight, you saw the opening credits to the film, which was directed by Robert Altman and released in 1970. Alongside this copy of the script, which is called the lined copy. You'll note that the name Louis Lombardo appears on the cover of the script. That's because this was his copy, and it came from his estate, in fact. The markup is by Joan Tewksbury, who was the script supervisor. At the end of every day of shooting, script supervisors continued working in their hotel rooms. Among other things, they edited and clarified the notes they took on set that day, producing a neat record that went on to their collaborators, editors, directors, and producers. Note here that everything is typed. This is impossible to create on the set. You can't lug around a typewriter while you're, standing next to the director in the rain. So something like Meta Wild script for Marvin Gardens had to precede this typed version, which is very much the product of work done after shooting wraps for the day. So on the left-hand verso, I'm going to zoom in again here. Okay, great. On the left-hand verso, we have descriptions of every piece of film shot for the script on the facing recto. Each row contains descriptive information about setups. Those are the various physical positions and technical specifications for the camera. Setups are distinguished by slate numbers. So those numbers here, that's the thing that goes clap when the director yells action. And they're described in terms of their perspective on the action. They don't describe the physical orientation of the camera in space. Rather, it's the end result recorded on film. And that makes sense, right? The editor wants to know what he's going to see. He doesn't care about how they set up the camera. So the opening was shot on both the A and the B camera. You can see that there and there. And they were using the same setup, so slate 1D, 1D, but with different lenses. So this was a 35 millimeter lens. This was a zoom at 35 to 500 millimeter. And from these descriptions of each setup, the editor can get a sense of what they're going to see when they put the piece of film on their moviola. Moving to a scene with dialogue. So there's some dialogue for you. Let's look at how the details about each take are recorded. So on the left, below the slate number, the script supervisor enumerates each take, describing it as complete or incomplete. So complete, incomplete, noting the time, how long it took, how long it actually is, the date of the shot. So this was shot on December 22nd. And they also offer information about the negatives. So these were printed, these negatives were developed. And also, I think this just meant there was no film in the camera on the first take, which I don't know why they would have done that. And so looking down the page, we can gather some pretty nice information. I'm going to zoom out again so you can see the whole thing about sort of what this whole page of the script looks like in terms of the film they produced. So they used 9 camera setups to shoot 35 takes on 2 consecutive days. Of those, they developed negatives for 29 takes, printed positive copies for the editor from 18 of those 29 takes. 2 takes on slate 48C and D were somehow no good and marked no print. So I think that's this one and that one. So on the right, you see slate numbers at the very top here, and those correspond to the slate numbers on the left. And these cap those lines that we've been seeing plunging through the text. So these lines give the script their moniker, the line script, and they mark coverage for each setup. Straight lines indicate that the camera caught the parts of the text that they run through. So all 17 takes on 48A, setup 48A, capture both characters speaking their dialogue and any action that's described in the descriptive paratext. Wiggles in the lines, so here, they show that those wiggles run through was not captured by the camera. So 48C, that's this one, that's focused on the kid. So you see him say what, but you don't say the cowboy say, I got hold up with the target practice. By contrast, 48S, you do see the cowboy while he's speaking his lines, but you don't see the kid as he's speaking his lines. So Lombardo could look at this page as he was editing and know that to show the cowboy and the kid in dialogue, he could choose from footage on setups 48C and S and others so that the audience can see at some point each character as they speak their lines. Watching the film with this script in hand, one can identify which takes made it into the final cut. If you really want to be that person and that person is not me, you could probably write some kind of final collation based on slate and take numbers, but I haven't tried. If that's you, you should maybe try. So if you were here again and you followed the action early on, you might have noticed that the script actually doesn't match up exactly with the footage that you see in the movie. And to me, what's amazing and wonderful about film is that you can shoot the script and still wind up with a totally different movie. So I hope that my remarks today have helped you to understand the materiality of that transformation and how that can actually happen. So I'll conclude with a quotation that I keep coming back to. In a recent interview with cineast, Canadian filmmaker Evan Johnson said the following: "Films depend on the illusion that they are one thing, a whole, rather than a garbage dump of disparate elements. Shots, cuts, sequences, sounds, people, haircuts, props, wallpaper, good decisions and bad, shoes, facial expressions, words. This is what they truly are." As bibliographers and book historians, we are, I think, uniquely positioned to address the garbage dump and to find meaning in it. After all, are books really so different? Are they not edited and sequenced arrangements of disparate elements derived from source materials and circumstances of production? Isn't bibliography concerned with looking behind the curtain to understand the people and the things and events that brought the material text into being? And are we not concerned with making visible the labor that goes into describing textual objects and making them accessible? For me, the answer is a resounding yes. So with that, I will stop my screen share, I think. And I'm excited to hear your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. That was really fascinating. And virtuosic in your management of the various screen setups that you have. So as usual, we have plenty of time for discussion. And if you use the raise hand function, we'll see you in our queue, and the floor is open. I see Derek Miller.
Hi, thank you so much. This is absolutely fabulous. I happen to have read Sidney Lumet's Making Movies a few weeks ago for different reasons, and now, of course, consider myself a complete expert on film. But this is so wonderful to see, and I love these materials. Well, what I wanted to ask about is to take advantage of your knowledge here and ask about the history of these documents and about their future from this moment you're showing us here, primarily in the 1970s. They seem to have a lot of strong relationship with stage theater prompt books in terms of the way they aggregate information about process as well as direct performance. And then I'm wondering what's happening in the digital age.
So that's a great question. And I was really lucky to be able to meet with a script supervisor who is working now. She worked on a recent movie you might have seen called Uncut Gems. So she uses an iPad and is using a program to enter all this information. And we had a long conversation about this. However, there are aspects of her job that require print, and she is carrying around a book and was actually like, I've never thought about using brads. Those work really well. I should try them because I'm always tearing pages on my binder. Which was what made me note the no-tear paper. This is a problem on the job. You need stuff to stay in the order that it belongs in. So I'm not sure what someplace like the Margaret Herrick Library is doing to preserve digital archives of screenwriters, for example. I mean, that would be the place that I would think is taking the lead there, but I'm not sure. USC would be another place I would inquire about, so how are you acquiring digital materials around this? But, basically screenplays go out to actors and everyone else as PDFs now. Nobody prints scripts, but the script supervisor is still using print and manuscript to do her thing on set.
Sonia, go ahead.
I have to unmute myself. Thank you, Erin. That was fascinating. I have a large diffuse question, and then I'll try and rein it in a little with a sub question to see if that might help. So I noticed that the script supervisors that you're speaking of are largely, if not all, are all women. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about the gendered dimension of this labor, and just to bring that even more closely to bibliography. When I collate a manuscript, what I'm looking for in the architecture of the book are discrepancies that might tell me more broadly about a cultural situation. Perhaps something was taken out of a book or something was added into that manuscript because devotional practice changed or a political interruption occurred. And I wonder whether there might be some evidence in these scripts that you're looking at, or shooting scripts, that the script supervisor's work, that might be, was there an exciting situation in which you see change or you see something annotated, and perhaps it relates to the social atmosphere in which these were produced?
So to answer the first part of your question first, I think that the main reason that women take on this role, which was originally called the script girl, in 1946, the role name was changed to script supervisor to gender neutralize it. And script supervisors are often called scripties on set today, which I learned is a non-neutral term, and many script supervisors will ask a director to say script supervisor, not scripty. I think it's a gendered role because of the feminization of secretarial work at the end of the 19th century, that women started learning stenography, typing skills, because you could imagine shorthand is a really useful skill for a script supervisor to have. I've seen shorthand annotations by secretaries working in writing departments on this stuff. I have not seen shorthand in script supervisor stuff, but that doesn't mean that people don't do it. It just might mean that it's like not done by the person, Meta Wild didn't know shorthand. I'm sorry, I need to put on my jacket because they've put on the air conditioning and it's blasting right on me. I'm so cold. So I think that answers the first part of your question. The second part I would say is, yes, the most interesting place to look for this sort of stuff is in the collection of the Breen Archive at the Margaret Herrick Library at, which is the American Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Library in LA. The Breen office were the censors in the 40s. So they were the ones that you'd send your script to, and they'd write you a letter and say, you have to take out this kiss and that infidelity and this gayness and this woman independence, or interracial relationship, definitely not, or even hint of interracial relationship. So there are scripts and corresponding letters in that archive that are just, it's a file cabinet collection where you could spend your entire life. So
is there any like subversion from the script supervisors where you can see they're pissed?
Well, this is more something that I think directors and secretaries would do rather than a script supervisor. So things that were commonly done were, and this happened in Citizen Kane, he put in a whole scene that took place in a whorehouse that he knew that the censors would pay attention to and say, you got to take out that whorehouse stuff. And instead, he could keep in maybe a couple of other things because they were so distracted by the overt sexuality in that part of the script. So lots of fun.
Peter, did you have a question? I saw something up on your, no. Okay.
I do, yeah.
You do, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
That was absolutely brilliant. It was just stunning. I mean, really stunning. And I'm thinking, I mean, the question in a way is how much, I mean, it's the use of bibliography, in other words, to do this unbelievably detailed thing. I mean, so there are two questions there, one of which it seems to me that films perhaps are the most interesting site for bibliography because they're so complex, because the amount of money involved. I mean, much less money is involved in in an original Shakespeare production. So that's one question, which is, what makes, the bibliographical aspect so fascinating in some ways is that there are so many documents. And the only thing I can think of that's equivalent is Tiffany Stern, and I don't know if you know her work, that she's been doing work on Shakespeare, where she's been breaking it down into parts and the ballads, a whole series of different things in parts that go into the making of a Shakespeare production originally, an early Shakespeare production. But the bigger question really is, one thing I see as massively continuous in what you're doing with classic bibliography is that discontinuity is in some ways the starting point, as I see it, for bibliography. And the discontinuity of any large book, I mean, for instance, the Gutenberg Bible, they started in 4 different places at once. So they literally, it's not continuous at all. It's literally got 4 printing presses that, they actually start and they basically divide up the Bible into 4 sections, purely by length, nothing textual. And then the second example that I'm thinking of in the you'll correct me, Zach, if I'm wrong about this, but the first folio, I think, is what's called a folio in sixes, which means that most of the gatherings are 3 sheets of paper folded inside each other. So literally it makes the 3 sheets make 6 leaves. So it's why it's called a folio in sixes, and it's 12 pages. But you never start, or they virtually never, to my knowledge, started on page 1. What you start with is you print page 6 and 7 first, and then you print 5 and 8, 4 and 9, 3 and 10, 2 and 11, and last of all, you print 1 and 12. So you're actually going backwards. So, I mean, all I'm thinking about is a kind of history of these radical discontinuities, which you were talking about in, so that just seems to me something worth pursuing in terms of the whole history of bibliography as changing your notion of how you think about a text at all, because you read these things, or you see them in the case of the cinema, totally continuously. And it seems to be one of the things that's bedeviled cinema history is that originally I tried to teach cinema way back. You actually had to take a projector into the classroom. I mean, that's how old I am. So you took a projector in, and it's a nightmare because you have to literally physically scroll back or forwards or whatever to find a scene if you want to show something. It was just a nightmare. So film studies, in other words, was probably the most backward technology when I started teaching. Teaching the Bible is so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that the thing that I love so much about working with scripts, and the reason that, when Bob said, hey, I have all this stuff, would you be interested in working on it? I just fell in love with it, was because one of the wonderful things about screenplays is they will also say, this is the date of this revision. So the leaf will call itself out as a revision leaf, which took all the hard work out of the bibliography with hand press materials. I mean, they're just telling you, and that's one of the things I love about film, is that the text itself, the printed text leading up to the final product, is so self-apparent because it's a working document. Whereas the final film, that coffee cup in Game of Thrones really got talked about a lot. People got crazy about that thing, and it's just one tiny mistake that breaks the whole illusion of, oh, these people are in wherever and who knows whatever. But I everything you've said speaks to exactly why I really kind of became obsessed with this material and dove so hard into it. So
fabulous.
Mia.
Hello, that was wonderful. I don't know if this is just the librarian in me, but seeing you go through that script where suddenly there were facts pages in there, kind of just like the preservation aspect of that put my heart in my mouth. And I thought, how is this still legible? Obviously these were working documents, and they're using metal brads to hold them together because being able to switch the pages in and out is what's most important. But I guess I'm sort of interested if you can answer even in a non-specific way about the sort of preservation aspects of working with these working documents.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that none of it all pales in comparison to nitrate film, which is explosive, literally. And probably why I'll never start dealing with that aspect of this. But there is a great book by a scholar in Australia that covers all of the preservation aspects and risks and care assessments, blah, 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 for all these materials. I forget, I will email it to you, and also Philip, I'll send it to you so that you can maybe put it in the notes for the video. But yeah, I think a lot of it at this point has to do with the fact that people aren't looking at this stuff quite so much. So yeah, all the print is still there. But it is, fax machines are thermostatic printing, which means that it will fade, and it will fade probably pretty quickly, especially if people start looking at this stuff more. So that's a great question though.
We had in the chat a question from Sean Quimby, who is the director of the Kislak Center here. He says, I'd be interested in learning more about the collectability of film scripts.
Oh.
When and why do these working documents start to get bound in leather, and what does that signify?
No, I hate these leather bindings so much. So this, I'm gonna share my screen again so that you can just see something on this. These are the people that do this. California bookbinding, they seem like the sort of, there we go. I think they're still active. I mean, this binding is super fresh. It's I think probably pretty new. I wonder if the family did it to sell the book, thinking maybe it would be more valuable, or I don't know, seem more special, or maybe he did it at some point, just never touched it. But one of the things that I really love about when these books are bound is that sometimes they were done by, let's say, a producer or a director, and then given to cast members in particular. Usually, I don't think I've ever seen one. Kevin Johnson might know if he sees them for more people, because he's handled way more scripts than I have. But usually you see them and they have stills in them. So you'll see, here's like the script for Johnny Guitar, and then there's pictures of Joan Crawford, on the set and in action. So usually there is some sort of presentation copy, or there can be a presentation copy aspect to this, but it doesn't have to be. I think it's sort of like it's very much like a collector's finding. Like, I think this is valuable, this is special to me, so I'm going to put this. He edited also, oh God, Brewster McCloud, California Split, Long Goodbye, did this with all of those, Louis Lombardo. So it's pretty common.
Liliana, I'll get to you in 1 second, but you mentioned a couple of times the coffee cup, famous continuity errors. And I had a couple of quick questions about that. One is that one of the guidebooks you were working with is called Beyond Continuity, which suggests to me that there's some effort on script supervisors' part to say, like, we do more than just continuity. And I'm wondering, like, what that's about. And the second question is, obviously, those of us who work in early, in Shakespeare, earlier theater, like Derek, you can't help but think of all these parallels.
Right.
And one of the interesting things I feel like about the film is there's a huge community of ordinary, lay people who are really interested in the technical workings of film, and blog about continuity and know what a script supervisor is and all that. And on the one hand, that seems kind of new and different. On the other hand, theater also has always had sort of famous moments where something goes wrong, and like that's the peering behind to the backstage, is something. There's something always thrilling about those moments, and in a way, the continuity error is like a good thing that happens too. I'm sure they're trying to avoid them, but it generates a lot of excitement. So I just wonder if you have any evidence in the work documents around script supervisors of like how nervous are they, how aware are they of how closely they're being watched. I would think this is quite different now from, say, even in the 70s.
I think that they do know how closely they're being watched, because there is this, the movie magic is something we've all heard of before, even if we've never really thought about what that means. And the magic is, especially if you are in a dark room, that you are taken away from wherever you are, and you are someplace else. And there's just so much writing, especially in early cinema. And this is very much about, as filmmaking developed in the beginning of the 20th century, one little tidbit I will just say is that at a certain point, up to a certain point, films only could be like 14 minutes long or something like that, because they couldn't figure out how to put multiple reels together and project them. So this is a totally bibliographical thing, right? Like suddenly the technology became adapted to be able to make longer movies. But anyway, I think that one of the things that you see so much writing about early film about is the story didn't make sense because he was on this side of the room and then he was on that side of the room. And I know that doesn't, and people really wanted in early cinema everything to make sense and everything to be continuous. I think now there might be a little bit more leeway with that because, like, you know, a Stan Brakhage and art films aren't continuous. They don't make sense. There's this whole zone of filmmaking now that plays with all these rules. But in terms of the manuals and what else they do, I've only just scratched the surface of what they do. And the Beyond Continuity title, you definitely caught on to something that they're talking about, which is like just tons of reporting. It's actually, it's extensive, intensive cataloging work, basically, of like activity during the day. That all relates to the output. But one other thing that they do is they make sure there's this whole thing about camera angles that I don't quite understand. I think I actually need to be on a set and have someone explain this to me about like where the camera can be and where the people can be so that there's some sort of straight line and things don't get messed up from the audience's perspective. And they also do that, and they have all these tricks and tips, and there's all this work they do before. So they line the script, and they can tell you, okay, this script is going to be 90 minutes long. And they have all these tools for doing that. So I feel like I've spoken about this in a little bit of a scattered way, but hopefully I've answered your question.
That last point sounds like casting off a printer's copy.
And you know, originally I was thinking a lot about, you know, trying to compare that stuff to earlier printed books, but sort of felt like I was running up against it, not being able to see things in person and go through and actually look at things and understand it myself. But I've thought a lot about casting off, about prompt books, and yeah, my sort of calling them the living catchword was the way to try to sort of make some reference to that. But yeah, there's so many parallels.
Liliana.
Oh.
Unmute.
Sorry. Thank you so much, Erin. I actually have two questions that are very different, but both touch the issue of continuity. You were saying very early on that you're not working with sound. And a lot of your description is very much quaint. I'm sorry to say it this way, quaint in the sense that it could be the silent movies. And once you think about adding sound and the fact that actors are being dubbed and films can get subtitles, but also dubbing in other countries, things change radically again. And I wonder whether you could reflect a little bit on the difficulties of studies that would come in if sound were to be added to your consideration. The second question is very different, and it deals with the fluidity of genre. When you showed us the beginning of the film, it said very clearly the film is based on a novel. Yeah. And in some ways, we are already used that a prose text, more rarely a theater, but often a prose text, is being translated into a film. But in recent years, we have another phenomenon that has become very common, that a film is being translated on stage. As a matter of fact, in the past, I would say 5-6 years in Germany, a country that I know well, you have most theater productions are either translations from novels or from movies. And so you have a fluidity to ask, where does the film end and what is still film? So I wonder whether you can address the question of sound and the question of genre.
So with sound, what I do understand so far is that the slate numbers are also, the slate numbers for camera setups relate also to the mic setups and sound recordings. So the description that and I've never seen one for sound as a script supervisor's markup for a sound editor. But one of the things that Meta Wild does is she will just make notes, and I didn't show her annotations because they're so hard to read. It took me a really long time to just get used to her hand, figure out what she's saying. She is making notes about like, oh, there was an external noise for this one, or she's very conscious of it. So you can then match up her notes in her handwritten script with the sound recording. And I would love at some point to be able to see, the kinds of documentation that the sound editor gets, because if the picture editor is getting documentation, then the sound editor is definitely.
Erin, I was also thinking actually of films where the actors may speak, but they don't turn up in the movie. Somebody else is dubbed in, or where the visual image of the actor and the voice is totally different.
Yeah, well, then there's just no continuity at all. I mean, you don't then. They do record like something like room tone. So the sound editor will just walk into a room with a mic and record the tone of the silent room where they are shooting. And I think in probably a well-dubbed film, they're working with the room tone track and maybe using sound recording technology to like splice dialogue over the room tone. But again, this is something that's like a whole new set of technical skills of sort of reading those things that I haven't, gone into yet. And of course, someone is also pointing out that Altman sound is a lot more generated on set, that he was very much doing sort of live sound and wasn't having actors overdub their lines. In fact, Warren Beatty famously went to an early screening of this film and was like, I can't hear anything, and just like walked out, and things were not good between them. But as far as the where does the film end or begin question go, I you're absolutely right. I just bought the novel for myself for McCabe as a birthday present. It's very rare if you ever see one that does not have Warren Beatty and the Judy Christie picture on the cover. You should definitely pick it up at a yard sale or whatever. But I mean, this is something that Bob is really interested into, the relationship between literature and film. And I haven't thought too much about adaptations of screenplays for the stage, but it's certainly, absolutely within this, exactly the kind of thing I'm hoping this talk will do is make people ask more questions like this about cinema and think more seriously about cinema as a material text.
Can I just follow up with two minor things because of what you said? First of all, I would be interested to hear what the framework of your collection is. If you buy the novel yourself, that's a private thing, but how are you collecting? Are you collecting everything around the film or just the scripts?
Since Bob is here, Bob, do you want to answer that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have chosen to collect the screenplays themselves. And I have also chosen to collect set photographs on the theory that set photographs are a visual parallel to screenplays because they contain tremendous amounts of information about the movie that doesn't make it onto the screen, and they are much higher resolution than a screen grab because of the technology of photography at the time relative to taking an image off a film negative. The continuity photographs taken during an Alfred Hitchcock film tell you more about the sets than you can glean from watching the movie because they have a higher resolution. And any photograph that relates to the making of the movie is fair game for me. So the contact sheet from Cool Hand Luke is an example of something that I would collect. I'm not as interested in publicity photographs that are released to promote the movie, but many of those photographs come from set photographs. So, you know, where do you draw the line? I do not collect the novels that relate to these movies because they're freely available. And if you need one, you can find it. And, you know, for the novels that relate to the movies that I'm interested in are collected 20th century novels because of their dust jacket and stuff like that. And that would be a drain on my capital resources to start buying valuable, pristine editions of the books that the movies are based on. But since they're out there and they're available, why not? Occasionally, we will buy a magazine run. So for example, The Postman Always Rings Twice was first serialized in a magazine. So we have the complete run of, I guess it was the Saturday Evening Post or one of those magazines.
That featured that story. Yeah.
Right. But, you know, The Postman Always Rings Twice, the novel, if you need to refer to it, you can find it. So we leave that, collecting that stuff to other people, because that can get very expensive. You know, one of the nice things about scripts is that relative to first editions, they're not that expensive unless you start to collect things like The Godfather or Apocalypse Now or Gone with the Wind or Citizen Kane. Then the documents start to get very expensive, or documents that have what I would call an artifactual value versus an archival value. These things that I collect have a powerful archival value, which becomes greater the more variants of the same document you gather together. Whereas John Wayne's working copy of The Searchers is a cool thing to have because it's, you know, it's like having Steve McQueen's watch from Le Mans or something like that. But it doesn't have the same kind of archival value that the document itself has. I mean, I happen to have John Wayne's working copy of The Searchers. There are a few doodles on it, but there are no notations.
Yeah.
And I have the most interesting thing about that is that he folded over the pages after every take. So the whole thing is folded in half eventually. But we have other copies of The Searchers, which are closer to script supervisor copies. They're master stencil copies that have lots of different people's handwritten comments on them. And those are more interesting to our purposes than having, you know, the artifact. So, and, you know, somebody asked about presentation copies. Those are more artifacts than they are archives, because those generally tend to be final shooting scripts, which are printed after the production and then bound as a gift for somebody. These scripts from Lombardo are an exception because they're working scripts that somebody decided to bind. But, you know, the presentation ones, you know, they're cool if you want to have something from Steve McQueen or Jerry Lewis in your library, but they don't tell you anything about the film that you don't already know from watching the movie, right? So.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting distinction that I think it will be familiar to people in rare books libraries, thinking about what to collect and how collecting habits have changed from beautiful, pristine books to books that actually tell you something about how they were made. Gary Dyer's had his hand up for a while and I accidentally took it down. So I'm going to go to you next.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful talk. in many ways, the script supervisor's notes are a rough draft of which a fair copy is soon made for the use of the editor.
Correct.
And here's the thing, with the two films you're dealing with there, how quickly was this fair copy made for the use of the editor? I assume pretty much daily. To what extent are there notes in the script supervised copies like you have that in a sense are not directed toward that purpose, where there's a kind of a thing there where it's not directed toward the version that goes to the editor? And the other question I have is, and also to what extent, and maybe someone has mentioned this already, but have people been able to compare script supervisor's copy with the editor's later editing notes and such?
I'm not aware, speaking to your second question, I'm not aware of any studies that have used that. I've looked really hard for any article that even mentions a script supervisor, and typically the only mention of them is if they've been interviewed about their interaction with like a director or an actor or something like that. So again, these aren't terribly common documents that have been viewed as preservable and relative to scholarship. So I don't know of anyone who's done that. And I've never encountered an editor's archive, primarily also because Bob is collecting screenplays rather than like, oh, I'm collecting this whole editor's file of papers. But it might be possible to, let's say, Lombardo's like working papers went to a library and his records, or maybe the studio kept them. You could bring this along and compare. It's possible, but I'm not aware of anyone having done that. And then as far as the fair copy question goes, yes, they were doing it on a daily basis. And yes, one of the things I love, and this is something that the script supervisor who worked on Uncut Gems told me, is that they're writing down all kinds of things about like, oh, this was a crappy performance by so-and-so, or notes about things that are going wrong that they definitely maybe don't want, that are for them to make sure that they maybe have to find a diplomatic way to tell the editor, oh, actually, Jack really blew it on that one, or was hungover that day, terrible, everything from that day, whatever, I don't know. But I'm so glad you used fair copy again. I should have used it throughout the talk, and it's something I'll do again. I think Lombardo's script is a fair copy of Tewksbury's original manuscript. So thank you.
Thank you.
I hope no one was writing his bad performance in Uncut Gems by Kevin Garnett, because he's fabulous in that movie. And that's a great movie. There's a question in the chat, and then we'll get to Jerry. A couple, they go together. Carolyn Salama asking, when or how did the convention of the lines with the slate numbers develop? And Lynn Farrington pointing out that theatrical prompt books often have blank pages inserted in them, so that is a kind of maybe a carryover from theatrical tradition. And I'll just show this copy at in the Kislak Center of a prompt book for Edwin Booth's version of Hamlet, which was printed in New York, but then used and annotated in Boston. And you can see interleavings with the local production markings. And I guess those questions to me go together. Can you talk at all about the history, like how did these particular conventions develop? Because some, it seems logical to imagine, derived from theatrical tradition. But the prompt book, I mean, there's just a fundamental difference in these texts, because the prompt book is geared towards controlling a live performance that happens all at once. Mm-hmm. The script supervisor's script is geared towards guiding in the editing process, which will assemble from pieces
and which accepts
film
variations in performances from,
So I could imagine that some things were rather easily carried over from a theatrical tradition in early film that a lot of people had come out of, and other things had to be developed fresh.
I had the same thought, exactly the same thought. I was like, oh, they must be copying theatrical scripts. When you look, so the person who has written the best history of the screenplay as a document is a guy called Steve Price. I wanted to invite him to this talk today, actually, to fact check me, basically, and see if he knew anything about this. But he used to be at the University of Bangor, I think, in the UK, and I can't find him anywhere now. But his book is great. And what his book does, and what his book taught me, is that the thing you have to remember is that stage plays have always had dialogue. Movies in the beginning had no dialogue, and there is actually a very strong evidence that the screenplay developed for motion pictures, with silent motion pictures, and then adapted from that to incorporate sound. And how they actually did this took numerous forms at different times, and eventually was, adopted the convention of, name in the center in all caps with your dialogue below. But I think that because the people who work on a stage versus in the movie business are so vastly, they're two completely different worlds. I don't actually think that there was much that, I think if you did a really serious comparison of like a 1971 prompt book to a prompt book, one of these, I don't think that you would find much in terms of similarity. And I think that they were emerging to do very similar things, but out of totally different spaces.
Sure.
Unmuting. Thank you. This was really wonderful. And I guess my question is about the script supervisor protocols and also about the manuscript practices. Are there differences between, say, a Hollywood studio film with a large budget and, how is this done in a movie with a shoestring budget? And then are they international, right? Or are there cultural differences in different film cultures between both how the script supervisor works, but also how the manuscript comes down to us? And what do differences tell us about a film, if there are indeed differences, or is it totally kind of regularized and universalized?
So, here is Mary Cebulski's Beyond Continuity. This is the other woman who has written these is Avril Rowlands, and she writes them for the UK. So there are slightly different procedures in the UK and America, and I have not gotten too far into like a real serious study of how those might be different. I will say that I think that there are going to be differences in national traditions of filmmaking, of how all of these things are dealt with, because actually scripts are done in slightly different ways in different countries. And also, it's interesting, different technologies are used in different countries. Like I typically see mimeographed, offset lithography, some kind of typewritten document if it's something in small copies, or Xerox for American scripts. I almost never see spirit duplication. I see spirit duplication in like copies of budget documents, but not for the scripts themselves. In France, I've seen spirit duplicated ones. Why this is, I don't really know. So there are these differences, and I'm sure there are differences of practice. Your first question was about, remind me. It was about.
I'm not sure I remember. I mean, it was, I think, major studio productions versus.
Oh, yes.
Independent films done on a shoestring, right?
Yeah. So this is a union job. One of the scripts that Bob has for Shampoo, also script supervised by Meta Wild, who some of you may know as the mistress for a very long time of William Faulkner. She published a memoir about her time with him and her work as a script supervisor from the mid 40s up until she was still working, through the early 80s, I think. But she was one of the founding members of the Script Supervisors Guild, and they did use that word guild, which I love. And now it is a union, it's a union job. So movies with big budgets have a union script supervisor. Movies with small budgets have either no script supervisor or a non-union script supervisor who is basically doing the work for very little money so that they can join the union. You do a certain number of non-union films, then you apply to be in the union, and then you can start making a living doing this work. But actually, through the conversation with the script supervisor, Sasha Vitelli, on Uncut Gems, I found out that the softies who directed that didn't have, Bob, it was their first, they had a script supervisor on Good Time. Movies before that, they never had a script supervisor. So they were working with smaller budgets, and yeah, this is something that, maybe there are more errors in those.
Well, I guess the smaller the budget, probably the less footage that's shot. So it's maybe.
Although with digital, and this is another thing that I learned, is that digital film, which I guess is an oxymoron, digital movie files, the editor really doesn't use the line script anymore because they're not printing any script. At the end of the day, they just get a dump of everything that was shot for that day. And then they just click and go through it, or their assistants go through it, and maybe they'll look at some notes, but not really. So the more stuff that's shot on, I think this really emphasizes the role of the script supervisor for preserving continuity on set rather than producing a fair copy of their notes for the editor later on.
And just one question. I mean, when you did start, you presented film as film. I mean, you're showing us the reels of film in the script. So this is a really naive question. Are most movies now filmed digitally, or is film still being used?
So much cheaper.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to print it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to send it to a lab, which, they have to get paid. And I will actually, since we're talking about physical film, I want to add one other anecdote, which I think is very bibliographical about McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is that Altman and his cinematographer, who I'm forgetting who it is now. I don't think it was Laszlo Kovacs for this movie, but they decided to do something called flash the negatives, which is treating the negatives in a certain way. And that's why this film has this very sort of like gritty, misty look. This is intentional. And they flashed the negatives because they wanted every print that came from everything they shot to have that look. If they flashed a copy of a print, then the studio could come in and say, no, we want this to be a perfectly clear picture. So they flashed the negative so that all prints from the negative would look that way in the future, which, yeah, again, this is a technical process that relates to the printing surface. So, yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot going on in the chat, but I'm not going to attempt to summarize it. There's a lot there, but it's very interesting. Some discussion of also the potential uses of the line script for reconstructing censored scenes, missing scenes, lost films. Do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, one of the things I love actually in the King of Marvin Garden script, which if anyone hasn't seen the movie, it's really a wonderful film, as is McCabe. It was a pleasure to work on both of these scripts because they're both movies I love. They shot, so the King of Marvin Gardens is about these two brothers and then this woman and her adopted daughter who form this very complex and intricate relationship, which ultimately, of course, ends in disaster. And there is a plot in the script in which David Stabler, the character played by Jack Nicholson, has sexual encounters and kind of this weird affair with the adopted daughter. Her name is Jessica. I forget who she was. She was played by someone who I've never seen in any other movie. but they cut all of it. They did shoot all of it, because you can see there's lines running through and descriptions and Meta Wild's notes and all this. And they cut all of it. And I think it was a really great decision for the film, because seeing the film, it would have been such a distraction if there was this kind of silly affair going on between these two people that didn't add anything to the story. And it gives so much more power to Ellen Burstyn's character and this sort of long decline that she goes on in the film. I think she may have won an Oscar for her performance, it's just incredible. And I love that they cut all that stuff, which they shot.
John, go ahead.
Thank you. It's dazzling. Thank you so much. And I'm more and more confused because I'm so ignorant of all this. But I was thinking of asking about, this sort of come up in the chat, like how many scripts does it take to have a full representation, a full quote unquote representation of a film thing? But maybe a different way of asking is about loss and sort of like, you know, and there's probably, I'm sure there's no way of generalizing, but maybe with some examples, like, you know, are a good many of these script supervisors things missing, or are archives like the ones you cited in LA full of the stuff, just hasn't been looked at? Are there 25 scripts for a given film? And if you really had the stamina and understood the code the way you are, you know, one could really build out big pictures. So just any thoughts on that sort of like loss and meaning, you know, because I'm looking at our collection, you know, we have one script of this, one script of that, and usually an actor's copy. It feels so incomplete given what you've described, which is just, you can't understand a movie with that. But, you know, so yeah, thanks.
So one of the reasons that I take such pleasure in focusing on the work of script supervisors is that, you know, there are just so many people, and especially women, who play these huge roles in film production that are not necessarily credited and are certainly not glamorous. And this, I think, has a lot to say about what ends up in an archive and what doesn't. So, and I mean, it was interesting talking to the Sasha Vitelli. She was like, you know, I never thought that I've kept all my scripts and I can't think of, it's hard for me to think of getting rid of them. But, you know, every time I move, I'm like, why am I schlepping these things around? And so I think that there's, in one respect, this stuff doesn't end up in collections because it's just not necessarily thought of as library material or as collectible. And, you know, it's not, go to the New York Antiquarian Book Fair. How many people do you see selling scripts? Not that many. There are a couple of booths where there are lots and lots of scripts, but it's a marginal part of the market. So I think that there is a loss, and I think that it's really unfortunate that the script supervisor script copies just, I think, have been lost. Like, I think that there's a lot that we're just never going to see, but, you know, I hope that at least you will now be on the lookout for them.
You're totally convinced me, and this is like, yeah, it's spectacular. And a lot
of this stuff too, you know, I comes up at auction. It doesn't even, you know, maybe it doesn't even get sold. So I think that that's part of it.
Well, it's funny because you know, you're emphasizing the draft-like nature of these is what's amazing, to use that word, I guess. And we value that now in literary worlds, and yet, despite the fact that film is, you know, film study is not a new discipline anymore, and yet it doesn't sound like these drafts, except for, you know, some smart people like you and Bob and a few others in this room. I mean, it just doesn't sound like the value has been seen yet. Just surprising in a way.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there are places that are collecting this stuff. You know, USC has tons of stuff. The RKO archive is at UCLA. UCLA also has tons of other cinematic collections. But again, these are arranged more around, they're really more considered archives in the very technical sense of that term. Like, this is the personal archive of David Selznick at the Ransom Center. And the thing that I think that is difficult to overcome from a curatorial perspective is that, okay, I'm going to pick one script out of this whole catalog, or I'm going to bid on this one script in this auction, and then knowing you may never acquire another copy of that script, which is, I think, why, and I think what works so well about Bob's collection is that, you know, having some focus is really important in terms of like either a genre that you're collecting around, or a writer, or some kind of focus that makes you say, okay, well, yes, that script, and then knowing, okay, well, I'm buying this one that isn't that exciting. It's just a copy of the script, but it's important for this reason because it relates to this general objective that I have. And then you can add on to it with these more exciting copies if and when they ever come up. And, you know, the other thing about it too is, like, compared to, you know, the kinds of stuff that comes up in the rare book market, this stuff is just, it's not going to eat up your budget. Let's just put it that way.
Robert, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to add an anecdote to that, since this is a highly bibliographic crowd that will answer your question. There's a great deal of randomness to how this stuff comes out. Obviously, when a David Selznick passes on, there's some institutional interest in his archive. But there's also a lot of this stuff floating around, like these Lou Lombardo scripts came from his daughter, and stuff that only accidentally sees the light of day that has enormous archival importance. And I'll tell one story at the risk of boring everybody, but Kevin Johnson, who's also on this Zoom, came to me 10 years ago with a very unusual draft of Planet of the Apes by Pierre Boulle himself, of which nobody was aware. And Planet of the Apes is a movie that has a long and tortured screenplay history with Franklin Schaffner and Rod Serling and all these people working on what was a difficult project. And when Pierre Boulle read Rod Serling's first script, he freaked out. He thought it was terrible. And he especially hated the ending where the Statue of Liberty is buried in the sand. And he wrote a spec script, which he sent to the studio saying, please don't desecrate my book. Here in my poor English is my shot at this, okay? And of course, nobody had heard anything about this, and including at the Bibliothèque Nationale, where they have like 3 full-time people curating the Pierre Boulle archive, right? So I happened to be in Paris curating a show at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and we were putting some Planet of the Apes stuff in there. And when Kevin came along with the script, I said, this script belongs at the BNF. And I bought it and I donated it to them because it was a significant addition to their understanding of the making of the movie. Now, where did this script come from? The answer is that it came from a box in the closet of a relatively marginal and uncredited script doctor who at one point was brought in to work on this problem script, and somebody in the studio gave him this thing and said, we got a headache here, see if you can fix it. And of course, they went on to make the movie, and the guy was paid and not credited. And if there's another copy of this that exists, since we know the Boulle archive didn't have one until I came along, it's in the vaults of the studio, and who knows when that's ever going to come out, right? So there's a lot of, interesting detective work going on here. So I just thought I would share that, since, you know, and that script cost a few $1,000s, and, you know, to get that kind of a bang for your buck with a book is tough, you know. So
it shows you how little authors know, because he wanted them to get rid of by far the most famous moment in the movie.
yeah, no, it shows you that
The Statue
in a
of
way
Liberty.
a novel is like a donor text to a movie, which is why it's so hard to make a great movie out of a great novel unless you really operate on it and change it a lot. The best adaptations are the loosest and most imaginative. The ones that are reverential and literal stink generally, right? So
I think that we have time for one more question. If someone has something burning on the tip of their tongue, but we are coming up on 7 o'clock. So I think we'll all just say thank you again to Erin for a really terrific presentation. I'm so glad that we were able to hear more about film after several years of not having one. So this was a really wonderful return to that subject for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's really been a lot of fun to be here. So.
And we'll see, I hope, many of you back next week. If you're not on our listserv and would like to be, do sign up at our website at materialtext.org. You can sign up there. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.